111.
This is the first in a series of lessons about rhetoric. I hope you watch them all if they're helpful, and I hope they are helpful. Here we go. All of my lessons come with the same three promises. Number one, I'll tell you what I'm going to tell you. Number two, I'll tell you. Number three, I'll tell you what I told you. I hope it helps.
I promise. Coming up.
Promise number one, I'll tell you what I'm going to tell you. So this is what we'll be covering today. So we'll start with some working definitions of rhetoric, just because we may not be familiar with the term yet. We'll learn a very, very tiny bit about Aristotle, just enough for our purposes so we kind of know who this intellectual giant is, basically. We'll cover Aristotle's definitions of rhetoric, the functions Aristotle says that rhetoric serves, and how to use the terms rhetoric and rhetorical.
I love
Aristotle's rhetoric.
Oh, yes. Rhetoric. I promise you, I promise. I'll tell you all about it.
It's important that we remember that for Aristotle, rhetoric is an art that involves practice and that also involves analysis. It enables practice and enables analysis. As a practical art, we can say, as a working definition from Aristotle, that it's a communication that is successful, or at least partially successful, or at least trying to be successful, in producing a desired or intended result. Me, down here, I just say it's communicating to get stuff done, because that's really what it is. We use this all the time. We use rhetoric every day. We just might not know it yet.
And that's one to grow on.
In terms of like the analytical power of rhetoric, Aristotle says that it helps you observe in any case the available means of persuasion. Like, we'll go into Aristotle's main rhetorical appeals, logos, pathos, ethos, later in a different video. But basically what he's saying is that rhetoric helps us figure out, analyze how we and others might possibly be persuasive. I say it's thinking about the analytical side of the art, thinking about how we communicate to get stuff done.
Aristotle. Hey, giddy up.
Who's this Aristotle fellow, you might be saying? Well, here's a little bit, very little bit. He's a Greek philosopher from the 4th century BCE, about 2,300 years ago. He taught and wrote about nearly everything. He wrote treatises on playwriting, on ethics, on politics. He wrote stuff on zoology. So we don't have everything of his extant. Like, if we had all of the treatises he wrote, it would cover an entire rack of shelves in a library. The man was prolific, and he was also just a polymath. He studied everything. He wanted to know the world. So this is the most brief thing I can mention, but he's a giant, and one of the things he studied and wrote about is rhetoric.
Rhetoric.
In his book, Rhetoric, this version says on rhetoric. This is the one I'm getting the quotations from, and I give citations at the bottom. If you get the slides in the description, you'll see the bibliographic information, and you can track that book down. So the version I'm using, at least, right? There's many of them. If you check Project Gutenberg, there's probably earlier translations. So Aristotle defines rhetoric formally twice in his Rhetoric, and the first one says that it can be defined as observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. This in any given case thing will be important later because not all situations are the same.
No.
And the second one is we may look upon as the power of observing the means of persuasion on almost any subject presented to us.
Rhetoric. Tell us how you do.
In terms of the functions that Aristotle ascribes to rhetoric, he again gives a couple different ones, but at root they're very similar. First, he says that it functions as a means to discern the real and the apparent means of persuasion in a situation. This idea of discerning the real and the apparent is part of the analytical part. And then note situation. He's big on mentioning that. And then second, he says its function is not simply to succeed in persuading, but to discover the means of coming near such success as the circumstances of each case allow. Again, each particular case. So a couple things. Situation, each case, right? Aristotle is big on the notion of Kairos, saying the right thing coming from the right person at the right time in the right way. I mentioned that Aristotle is big on Kairos, and I should pause just for a moment to let you know what Kairos is. Kairos is the right time, the right situation for rhetoric to be persuasive, to be introduced into a situation in order to change things. But you have to do it in the right measure. So if you notice the relief painting here it's a relief sculpture here of the Greek demigod Kairos, the god of timing and appropriate, opportune moments. He is walking on a razor's edge. He has wings on his back and feet, right? So he's balancing. He's fast. He's got justice in his hands, the scales of justice, because making the right decision is crucial. And notice that he only has hair in front. In the back, he's bald. That means once he's gone past you, you can't grab him. That's why people say things like strike while the iron is hot, or seize the day, or seize the moment. Once that kairotic moment runs past you, it's too late. Look for a more detailed discussion of Kairos in future lessons. Now we can go back to my discussion of why each rhetorical situation is unique and why no one utterance is ever going to be persuasive in all contexts and all situations. And that's very, very, very bound up into context and situations in particular cases. No one statement is going to be persuasive rhetorically across the board.
Nope.
It depends on the speaker, the audience, the occasion, the seriousness of the situation, where they are, the cultural practices and mores. A lot. There's a lot. Second thing is that he talks about it's not simply to succeed, but to come near success. My mom used to always say, don't let perfect get in the way of good. And I think Aristotle would agree with her.
Rhetoric.
Terminology, but it's essential, mean anything.
I figured this might be a good time to pause for a brief terminology note. When we say rhetoric, we usually use it as the noun, and we usually use it to mean persuasion or something real close there too, right? And when we say rhetorical, we usually use that as an adjective, and we use it to mean something like persuasive or something real close there too. So if we're going to use the noun form rhetoric, the example, I'm not persuaded by the candidate's rhetoric. If we're going to use it as rhetorical, the adjective form, the ad campaign's rhetorical strategies are effective. So rhetoric, you can just say, is the noun, and we can use that as basically, kind of, at least for our purposes at first, interchangeable with persuasion, and that rhetorical can be used basically for our purposes for now, interchangeably with persuasive.
Rhetoric. Promise you, I promise. One more time.
We talked about some working definitions of rhetoric that give us a foot in the door. We talked a tiny bit about the giant Aristotle. We went over the two main definitions of rhetoric that Aristotle provides in the Rhetoric. We talked about the functions of rhetoric that Aristotle says are served in the book. We talked about, we took a little break, a detour to talk about how to use the word rhetoric and how to use the word rhetorical. Rhetoric, the noun, persuasion, and rhetorical, the adjective, persuasive.
Now we know. And knowing is half the battle.
This is a very, very, very introductory lesson. There's going to be more to come. I hope they're helpful, and I'll see you then.
What's the 411, huh?